You could smell them coming, it was said, even before you heard the thunder of their hooves. But by then it was too late. Within seconds came the first murderous turn of her arrows, blotting out the sun and turning day into night. Then they were on you, slaughtering, raping, pillaging and burning. Like molten lava, they destroyed everything in their path. Behind them, they left a trail of smoking cities and bleached bones, leading all the way back to their homeland in Central Asia. Soldiers of Antichrist came to reap the last dreadful harvest, was one 13th century scholar's opinion of the Mongol horde. The agility of the Mongol on his horse and the uncanny tactics of his commander caused fear to run rampant in any army that stood in the way. Tactics used in tribal warfare since ancient times had enabled them to dominate vastly superior armies with very little loss to themselves. Their tactic of momentary retreat provided the perfect ruse to lure even the most experienced commanders to their doom. Strongholds thought impregnable were quickly captured with the use of these savage tactics. Ditches were filled with human corpses. Prisoners were made to off scaling ladders onto the walls of the battlements of their own city, while others were used as meat shields to protect the Mongol warriors from heavy fire. Some defenders would recognize their own family members amongst the captured and refuse to shoot. More than often, their future subjects would hear of their barbarism and their rapid advance towards their own kingdom and submit before the Mongol war machine engulfs them within its wrath, as it has done to whoever dare stand against it. Those too foolish or too slow to not surrender were doomed to face certain death, as their citizens were scorched in fire, disemboweled with swords, and had their women and children leave their bodily sanctity at the mercy of the victors. A well-known rumour at the time stated that once the settlements was captured, the hungry Mongol soldiers would feast upon the body of the slain, and the Mongol commanders got the price cut, breasts of the virgins. As the commanders repugnantly feasted upon their spoils, they would do so whilst gathering on top of wooden planks, with the enemy leaders underneath. The last thing they would hear would be the jeers of the Mongols as they are slowly crushed to death. Often inhabitants of whole cities would be put to the sword and any survivors were sold into slavery en masse. The Mongol horde was unleashed onto the world with the leadership and charisma of a literate chief of a small and insignificant tribe in the Mongol heartland. Little did this minor chief of an unknown tribe know, his fame and significance unto the world was to eclipse even that of Alexander the Great. His genius in the art of war was no less than Alexander either, as he quickly united the Mongol tribes after winning a war against his rival. In a ceremony, he was proclaimed to be chosen of the gods as the conqueror of the world. Thus, he was bestowed the title of Genghis Khan, meaning King of the Universe. In the next 30 years, after his ascendance to the Mongol throne, he and his successors would carve out the largest land empire in existence. The Mongol yoke was spread from Korea to Poland, encompassing nearly the entirety of the civilized world at the time. The principalities of the Eastern Slavs, constantly engaged in warfare with each other, failed to notice the Mongol threat on the horizon before it was too late. Finally, peering their gaze towards the Mongols, they abandoned their quarrels to face this new threat. Their combined forces met the Mongols by the Kalka River, intoxicated by their own superiority on the battlefield. The more foolhardy of the princes mindlessly charged at the Mongols, falling for their tricks. With their tactic of feigned retreat, the Mongols were able to split up the Rus forces and butcher them. The Mongols ravaged the Russian lands after the victory, but did not stay to rule over their fallen foes, as they had to travel back to Mongolia for the ascension of the new Khan. The Rus princedoms continued to quarrel amongst themselves after these invaders disappeared back to their homeland. Known to them, the invasion was merely postponed, as 12 years after the battle, the new Mongol force of 35,000 horsemen and 40,000 Turk tribesmen led by Batu Khan rained down on the suspecting Russians. This time they were here to stay. The East Slavic people met the full force of the Mongol war machine. One by one, the cities of Ryazan, Vladimir, Kolomna, Moscow, and Vladimir Suzdal fell, and with the capture of Kiev, what little hope that remained for resistance was extinguished. Only the city of Novgorod was spared due to their preemptive surrender. The Mongols now embed themselves in the Russian heart, set up their capital at Sarai on the lower Volga River. Over time, more and more of the natives began to resemble their oppressors. Some of the major principalities were left to govern themselves so long as they paid tribute. If they, for whatever reason, failed to do this, then the Mongol wrath would bear down upon them, as whole cities would be slaughtered. Year by year, the princes became more tyrannical, as they tried to squeeze every last bit of coin from their already starving people to appease their Mongol masters. 500,000 Russians were perished during the reign of the Mongols. The effects of this nightmarish age, known as a black chapter in Russian history, lasted for over 200 years, and can still be felt in Russia today. The material and economic devastation that was experienced at this time led to the collapse of the Russian economy and industry, which left no jobs to the common people, forcing them into the life of serfdom for the richer nobles. Old Byzantine customs and administration system of Justinian was also abandoned in place for the new Asiatic system, which left Russian principalities separated from the influence of the West. Their abandonment of Western ideals did not, however, spare them from the predatory gaze of their European neighbours, as the Teutons, Sweden, Lithuania and Poland all joined in to carve out their slice of the Russian cake. These events also caused the Rus people to split into three distinct cultures: Belarusian, Ukrainian Mongolian and Russian, as they were incorporated into enemy territories. The Mongols weren't interested in protection of the Russians and would not interrupt so long as they kept paying tribute. The two invested in their Asian territories, where they lay prosperous cities of the Islamic world: Bukhara, Samarkand, Herat, and Baghdad. The enemies on all sides, the Russians grew more and more paranoid day by day. Their future was unknown, as they were encircled by wolves, ready to tear them up limb by limb if they faltered in their resolve. This paranoia was to penetrate itself into the mind of the Russians to the one day, so deep was a scar. The fear was reinforced after Napoleon's invasion and again reached its peak after Nazi Germany's attempt to enslave the Russian nation pushed beyond the Urals. However, sticking to our narrative, during this time the fate of the Russian people hanged on by a thread. Unlike the armies of Napoleon and Hitler, the Mongols were master of the steppe warfare and knew the Russian terrain as if it was their own. So close were they to being dissolved into obscurity. A light was needed to guide these lost people out of the darkness and into the new age, whatever challenges came with it. In 1440, the light was lit upon the throne of the Princedom of Muscovy with the succession of Ivan the Great. Moscow, at the time of the Mongol conquest, was a petite and insignificant provincial town, but its princes were the most resentful and cautious of the Mongols. By careful tribulation to the Mongols, they ruled to gain their trust, which allowed them to secure a greater deal of freedom and power. As the years passed, they managed to snatch more and more land from their neighbours, as the Mongols were too busy administrating the great cities of Asia than to be alarmed by this minor princedom of insignificant people. Their failure to notice the ever-growing threat of Muscovy was to bite the Mongols when the least expected. The year was 1480. Ivan, the Grand Prince of Muscovy, tore the peace treaty with his Mongol overlord. Worst, he outright dishonored the Mongols by slaying their envoys in the court. One of the envoys was able to escape, however, and deliver the news of this heinous act to his master. After committing this act of defiance, there was no turning back. He had invoked the fury of the Mongols. From this point, there was only destruction or glory. Hearing of this, Ahmed Khan, the leader of the Golden Horde that controlled the Mongols' European territories, rapidly assembled his force of marauders. Ahmed was determined to teach this degenerate Russian underdog a lesson he and his people would never forget. The Russian princedoms, so long under the Mongol subjugation, had never arose a thought in the Mongols that they could ever be a threat to them. With this thought, Ahmed rode out towards the Russian heartland to sever its arteries as a slave master to punish his slave. One can then imagine the surprise he must have felt when he encountered a large and well-equipped Muscovite army under Ivan on the opposite banks of the Urga River. Weeks passed as the two foes peered at each other, both unsure and unwilling to engage. But winter was quickly approaching, and the river began to freeze. The two sides could no longer be kept apart. It was time to engage. Men geared up with their weapons, ready to be the oppressors or the oppressed. However, when it was finally time to engage, both sides stopped right in their tracks and ran in the opposite direction. The battle was concluded without a single clash of swords. Although neither side won the battle, the Russians were to benefit from this far more than the Mongols. They now knew that the enemy was not once how it used to be. They now knew that the once mighty empire of these ferocious horsemen had all but deteriorated into minor kingdoms. They now knew that they had the upper hand, as their foe had finally lost the will to fight. After 200 years, the Mongol yoke has finally been uplifted. With their freedom all but secured, a new age began for the Russian people, an age of expansion into the vast and mysterious lands of Asia, but also into the familiar lands of Europe. The first thrust in the train of Russian expansion was propelled by one of Ivan the Great's successors, Ivan Grozny, nicknamed Ivan the Terrible due to his tyrannical nature. Hungry to right the wrongs done by the Mongols, he stormed the Mongol fortress at Kazan and slaughtered all the defenders. The Khanate of Astrakhan met the same fate. Thus, 2 out of the 3 remaining Mongol strongholds on Russian soil were met with desolation and dissolved into the ever-growing empire of Muscovy. Only the Crimean Khanate was spared the wrath of the Russians as it enjoyed Ottoman protection. For the next century, Russian explorers would venture out in the vast unknowns of Siberia, named after the Mongol Khanate of Sibir, lying east of Kazan. They wouldn't stop until they had reached the Pacific seaboard. This would be the greatest colonial expansion in human history, only comparable to the settlement of North America by European settlers. In the next 100 years after defeating the Mongols, the Muscovite explorers would deliver 4,000 miles of fresh territory to the Tsars. This also gave a chance for the dying Russian economy to revive, as the fur trade flourished with abundant supplies being transported from Siberia every day. However, this reformed upstart empire had not fully recovered from the blow delivered to them by the Mongols, as most of their country is still stricken with poverty and backwardness. A succession of brilliant Tsars and opportunistic expansionism would be needed to finally make this humdrum nation into a respected superpower.